is Iran going to be pulled into the Israel-Hamas war? Because that's what the markets really want to know.
I mean, they're very active in providing support, intel, whatever it is. The explosion, I think that's probably the main thing that markets should keep in mind. There was a massive explosion yesterday in Iran, killed over 100 people. It's the worst killing in Iran for a long time. And ISIS, the Islamic State, came out with a statement about 2 hours ago stating that they were the culprits. Now, whether or not we fully believe them is another matter. People are going to speculate and say, oh, it was Israel or Iran did it as a false flag. But this is a bad thing. And it's I think, representation of the fact that everybody in the Middle East is being affected in some way or another by independent events that are all somewhat linked to the war that occurred since October 7th, right? But I still refrain from believing that Iran will directly enter the conflict.
What are the top geopolitical risks that could potentially move the markets and have huge ramifications for the global economy in 2024 and 2025 and beyond? This is the theme of our conversation with our next guest, Pyotr Kurzin. He is a geopolitical strategist and the host of his own show, The Global Gambit, on YouTube. I suggest everybody check it out. Fantastic show. I'll put the link in the description down below. Just a word about me. In January, later on this month, I'll be attending the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference, link down below. Great show. I'll be doing some presentations there and moderating some panels, and I'll be doing interviews with the speakers as well. So come check it out if you're in Vancouver. Pyotr, Happy New Year. Thanks for being back.
Happy New Year. And yeah, there's always something to talk about since I was on an entire new war in the Middle East. But I think we'll be focusing on some other issues tonight.
Well, before we talk about specific hotspots that are of interest to you, let's talk about hotspots that overall may be of interest to my audience, which is the investor community. Top geopolitical events around the world. It doesn't have to be skirmishes or wars. It could be developing events, could be mega trends that you're eyeing that you think could have the biggest impact on financial markets in 2024 or perhaps beyond. Let's start with that.
Sure. So I think, considering this is a financial economic focused podcast and show, I think one of the biggest developments is related to the Israel and Gaza war. But it's not the war itself. It's one of the ramifications that has come out of it, which is that in Yemen, there has been a ceasefire for the past year, almost 2 years, but that is looking very unstable because of the war. And the Houthis, which are the rebel group operating in large parts of the country, are increasingly disrupting trade flows. As we know, one of the biggest commercial trade routes is through the Gulf of Aden, which leads up to the Suez Canal. And the Houthis have been hitting big freight line shipping companies and so on hard. Just yesterday, a coalition of about 20 states, I believe, including the US, UK, and others, released a very blunt statement saying, if you do not change your direction, if you don't cease in your operations or in your terroristic activity, we will respond. Now, we're not sure entirely how that would look like, probably financial sanctions and things like that to try and curb the impact of the Houthis. But major shipping companies like Maersk and others have essentially said, we're probably going to discontinue this route until there are greater insurances of stability. So that is definitely going to impact, I think, quite a few countries. The second one from a market standpoint would probably be just China and its economic conditions. I'm not going to play down that everyone is facing, obviously, continued inflationary pressure. There's a lot of problems, even in the Taiwanese election that we might touch upon later. Younger generations are worried about wage rates and also house price hikes in those sorts of areas. And China's economy being what it is, I think is facing economic headwinds. That's why we've seen a change of tone in President Xi for quite a few weeks now, particularly since the APEC meetings in San Francisco back in November. They're more reconciliatory, they're more constructive, they're less critical. Even Chinese media has been quite sort of positive almost of US-Chinese relations, or more hopeful. So I think just generally the conditions of the Chinese economy for much of the year will have an impact on a few things, and we can dive into some of those in a bit. And then just the last one, potentially, I would say is Southeast Asia as well. The South Koreans have an election. Japan is facing economic fluctuations, also with the impact of the earthquake, which it has managed relatively well, but just the Southeast area, again, sort of indirectly affected by China, I do think is going to be a bit of a hotspot potentially for disruption. I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what happens, but I do think that could be something to take note of. And actually, very last, just as a tag on OPEC, I do think that there are rumbles in OPEC. There are, developments going on in the OPEC community about just oil. We've seen some interesting shifts happen in the past year under the leadership of the Saudis, obviously, and again, indirectly because of the Israeli-Gaza war. I think that could have some impacts as well.
Since you brought up the Houthis, Pyotr, I have to bring up what Iran has been doing. So recently, in the last 2 days, they dispatched a naval frigate to the Red Sea. I don't know what's happened. No reports of a direct naval confrontation have surfaced yet, but I'm wondering if this is just posturing or are they responding to something? But more broadly speaking, is Iran going to be pulled into the Israel-Hamas war? Because that's what the markets really want to know.
No, I completely understand. There's been a lot of events with Iran in the past 2 days alone. They're very omnipresent in the entire Middle East situation, let alone Israel-Gaza. And the frigate that you're talking about was not widely reported on. There's a couple of points of note here. It's very old. It's 51 years old. And you're not going to lead some kind of maritime operation against the United States coalition there with one very old frigate that was sold to you by the Brits many years ago. But to the broader point about whether the Iranians are pulled in directly, I mean, they're very active in providing support, intel, whatever it is, to the Houthis, which are their flagship organization or group in the Yemen area in the Gulf of Aden. They're not their flagship group overall. That's Hezbollah. And the explosion, I think that's probably the main thing that markets should keep in mind. There was a massive explosion yesterday in Iran, killed over 100 people. It's the worst killing in Iran for a long time. And ISIS, the Islamic State, came out with a statement about 2 hours ago stating that they were the culprits. Now, whether or not we fully believe them is another matter. People are going to speculate and say, oh, it was Israel or Iran did it as a false flag. But this is a bad thing. And it's I think, representation of the fact that everybody in the Middle East is being affected in some way or another by independent events that are all somewhat linked to the war that occurred since October 7th, right? But I still refrain from believing that Iran will directly enter the conflict. And there's a couple of distinctions here. So one, will Iran directly enter the conflict in a conventional kinetic sense? We're going to see IRGC and troops and a full-scale aerial, involvement fighting Israel and therefore other countries? No, I don't think so. What I think is more possible is the Iranians decide to block the Strait of Hormuz, another major maritime pathway. As we saw 3 or 4 years ago, they did this. They took over some ships, disrupted oil. They did that with a British tanker, I believe, in June of 2019. So they could do something like that again. They could increase their activities in their near abroad, so Iraq. And they could just ask their proxies to up the ante. They could just ask Hezbollah to be more aggressive, fire more rockets as they've threatened to do against Tel Aviv and so on. So it's a spectrum, there's many things, but I don't think a direct confrontation with Iran, as Lindsey Graham seems to want to do, is on the cards.
I wonder if we're seeing a new alliance emerge, or a series of alliances emerge, a new world order, if you want to call it that. Earlier this summer, as you're aware, 6 new countries have expressed interest to join the BRICS, including Iran and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Clearly, we're seeing a bifurcation in attitudes towards the Israel-Hamas war. Do you think, we're going to see basically a proxy war emerge in the Middle East between the West and its adversaries?
Yeah, I think that there's 2 things I would say to that. One, I had a very interesting conversation on the show about this with the former bureau chief of Baghdad on the Middle East. She's now a correspondent at large, I think, for the Washington Post, Liz Sly, and she basically told me that there are fears a axis or an non-state NATO kind of equivalent could develop in the Middle East. So, you know, we've got this coalition of countries that obviously cooperate under collective security assurances in Europe. And she's saying that the axis of resistance, as it's called, which includes all the proxies I've mentioned before, and Iran and Syria and things like that, are working together to deepen their sort of, you know, an attack on us as attack on all sort of thing. Very interesting. Not really sure how it would operate, so to speak, but she did make quite explicit mention to that, and I have heard similar rumblings across other policymakers in the US and parts of the West. But to the broader question of the BRICS, I would keep in mind that Argentina withdrew. Javier Milei is not doing what we expected, and he's putting his country through very typical neoliberal austerity, which is not really what I think many anti-Western or non-Western states would assume they would want to do. So they've pulled out of BRICS. The other 5 members, I believe, 4 or 5 members, joined officially 2 days ago, or 2-3 days ago. But there's a massive problem with this, which is, one, the BRICS are a group whose biggest collective interest is usurping, or at least undermining, challenging the United States hegemon, undermining the US-dominated economic system. Now, no one's denying the challenges that the United States has, or the West has, but that is a fundamental flaw in the BRICS. And of the groups, of the members, excuse me, 2 sets of them, 2 specific relationships are a problem: China and India, Iran and Saudi Arabia. I'm not really going to elaborate onto as to why. I think some of your viewers will probably be aware of that. Chinese and Indians, because of their war a few years ago in India and Saudi Arabia, Iran and Saudi Arabia, for very obvious reasons. All of these things limit the capacity for the BRICS to be fully coherent, cohesive, and cooperate. So I think that there's a problem with the BRICS, period, let alone in some of them coming together to support some kind of broader Middle Eastern proxy war. I think it's more within the interests of the Chinese and the Russians. The Indians aren't interested. If anything, the Indians would work with the Americans in a group called I2U2, which is sort of, I'm sure you've heard of the Quad, which is a group in Asia. Well, India has joined a sort of Western, Middle Eastern style Quad with Israel, UAE, and America, directly operating in the Red Sea. So I personally think that the BRICS inability to work together against the US on one side of this issue is non-existent. And I want to premise all these points by just saying that this is a descriptive response. It's not prescriptive. I'm not pretending to know. I'm just saying what could happen. So in case viewers are like, oh, he's too drunk on anti-BRICS. I'm not. I'm just acknowledging the limitations.
I understand. Yes. Okay. I want to move to the C of the BRICS, China. Clearly, they're eyeing the Taiwanese elections that's happening later this month. I'm looking at the polls now, currently favoring the DPP, which is the party that's pro-U.S. and anti-reunification. That's the party that's currently in power. Should they win again, that's going to destabilize the status quo, of course. The status quo being that China wants reunification. In fact, Xi Jinping, in his latest address, doubled down on the fact that reunification is more or less inevitable. He didn't give an exact timeline, I don't think, but I don't. Basically, he's not changing his stance. So, if nothing changes, Pyotr, then what could change, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of things I would frame differently to what you said.
Okay.
I mean, the DPP is leading. It was, last time I saw it was on about 40%.
Okay.
But the TPP and the KMT, I mean, the whole thing's been blown upside down because of the introduction of the TPP, which is this third party run by a rather charismatic entity chap who wants to engage the young voters particularly. The KMT was polling around 30%, and then the TPP around 20%. Now, this has increased even more in terms of the margins have reduced even more. But there is a difference in that the DPP has largely wanted to maintain the status quo. They've discontinued engagement with China since 2016, but they do prefer obviously the status quo over completely just striving for independence. And we've seen this illustrated by Lao, the leader of the DPP, who has basically suggested that he wants to carry over many of the policies by Sao, his predecessor, and not rock the boat too much. China's obviously vehemently against this chap because, well, he's the one whose party subliminally wants to eventually, longer term, maybe end up with independence. But so that's where I just make a slight distinction. Yeah, it's not going to necessarily change anything immediately, and therefore the United States foreign policy isn't going to necessarily change immediately. What I do think is worth noting here, though, is it's not just about those two, it's about also the Chinese. And for the reasons that we've highlighted a little bit earlier on, the Chinese are facing some difficulties. The United States policies, which Biden has largely rolled over from the Trump administration, this emphasis of decoupling, have began to eat away at the Chinese economy. And the interesting thing I had with a conversation with a chap from Nikkei Asia about this was that the US is really wanting to begin to shift towards what the US administration calls a small fence, high yard approach. Small yard, high fence approach, which is basically they want to really, really limit what trade is done with Chinese in high-tech, sensitive, strategically important assets, whilst retaining overall trade with Chinese, because the idea of decoupling is a buzzword that's become very popular amongst media, academia, and so on, but it's not realistic. And this was only, I think, doubled down on by the Europeans, the EU, when they said we want to de-risk last year, which is the Europeans' version of decouple or small yard, So personally, for me, I don't think necessarily that the foreign policy of the US is going to change incredibly quickly, but they want to be protectionist. They want to protect their intellectual property rights, which China has been, messing around with, and Taiwan is a component of that, given the chips production and the chips bill that Biden introduced and has been undermining China's advanced technological sector.
Chips are the core of the argument. I'm going to come back to that. A very important thing you brought up, but I want to just first address the elections one more time. Do you think, again, big question, I know, but do you think that you're seeing signs, or are you seeing signs that the Chinese will take Taiwan by force sooner rather than later?
No. And I used to be more hesitant on that question, but the time horizon for China is shrinking. I'm not saying it's impossible. Again, people don't jump on me with sort of like, oh, he said this. It's more nuanced, of course, but we have limited time. So I largely deviating towards the no side, because most analysts agree the best year would actually be 2027. Suggestions are that China's overall military capacity will be at this time before its overall economic, demographic, and so on dividends begin to decrease even more. However, last year, when India overtook China's economy, population size, and China's overall population decreased by 900,000, a lot of onlookers were surprised, because it was like, oh, its demographic dividend has come to an end much sooner. So the idea that China could launch some effective maritime operation against Taiwan without having a systemic long-term impact on the economy is even smaller now. So I personally think that if Xi wants to do it, he needs to get on with it. And at the moment, they're just not ready. That's the other thing. So he's got to balance the short-term needs to develop the military capacity to do so versus the longer-term setbacks that will come from, well, China just becoming a more quote-unquote advanced economy, albeit with a much more lopsided demography and certain sectors. So for me, I don't think so. They're going to respond. I guarantee you that if the DPP win outright and the leader makes some pretty strong statements, then they'll make some, maritime performative posturing. They will surround the island. They will do flyovers. They'll do things that we've seen in the past few years.
Yes.
And the last point I'll make is that, the US will have to play this delicately, but as long as they don't send, a senior political figure, as long as Nancy Pelosi doesn't turn up on a jet again, then that probably will minimize the antagonization of the CCP. But it's, we can't tell what the US might choose to do.
Oh boy. All right. No comment on Nancy Pelosi, but I do want to touch on the semiconductors. Key point you brought up: China is developing their own answer to Taiwan Semiconductor Company. I don't think they're there yet in terms of the technological sophistication of their chips, but they're advancing. And so I'll just read you this headline. You're no doubt aware that China has been banning certain Apple products. It's starting to escalate. As of December 15th, I'm reading this Reuters article. China's ban on Apple's iPhone accelerates, according to Bloomberg News. More Chinese agencies and state-backed companies across the country have asked their staff not to bring Apple iPhones and other foreign devices to work, Bloomberg reported on Friday, citing people familiar with the matter. For over a decade, China has been seeking to reduce reliance on foreign technologies, asking state-affiliated firms such as banks to switch to local software and promoting domestic semiconductor chip manufacturing. Pyotr, should this continue to escalate, could we see a complete ban of Apple products in China? Now, I don't think Apple disclosed how much of their revenues come from China exactly, but it's a sizable amount. Should Apple be banned, we're looking at a complete wipeout of valuations for Apple, and Apple being one of the largest companies in the S&P, that's going to bring down the entire index.
Yeah, that's a very niche area that I haven't focused on as much, but
right.
It's definitely a problem.
I mean, just without talking about Apple specifically, but just the Chinese attitude towards their, quoting this article, reliance on foreign technologies. What is their end goal from a geopolitical standpoint?
Well, that's part of the reason that Taiwan is important to them. A lot of people will focus on the symbolism. They'll talk about the national rejuvenation argument, but it's also strategical, much like Russia with Ukraine. Putin will talk about the advancement of NATO and protecting his near abroad, but it's largely about access to the Black Sea. And it's the same with Taiwan. Taiwan produces 70 to 80%, I think, of semiconductors, high-end semiconductors. And as I stated before, the CHIPS bill, which was implemented by the Dutch and the Japanese, which is important because those two countries, along with the US, produce some of the most critical components for high-end tech pieces like Apple, are hitting the Chinese. That's part of the reason they are, changing their rhetoric. And geopolitically speaking, we can see this play out in the sense of Musk was in China relatively recently. So was the head of Apple, I believe, with Tim Cook. I think he was there relatively recently. You've had a few industry leaders essentially that have paid visits to China, and they've been treated exceptionally well, much more than US policymakers were, at least until the last, say, month and a half. And so China is very well aware that whilst it is the world's economic workshop, so to speak, that is not necessarily the case. There is a growing outsourcing from China to Vietnam, for example. The Biden administration was in Vietnam after the G20 meeting, I believe, last year, and they re-established, reinforced a strong meeting around economic ties. And if the US and other major partners can find areas to drive innovation, development, and high-quality production lines, supply chains, if they can diversify, it's all about diversification at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And that's really going to cripple China. It's really going to keep China's, and whilst China has markets, we've seen a massive increase in the amount of what's known as CNCs, certain technology used for military equipment in Russia. That is not the same quality of tech as is China needs and has in its markets with the Americans or whoever it is. So this it's a problem for the Chinese, and we talk about friendshoring. I'll land with this last point, which is the friendshoring. So the US, along with other countries similar, want to emphasize more of their production in countries that may not be best friends. They might not be the British or the French or something, but partners who are more reliable. So the Vietnams, the Mexicos, the Argentinas of the world. And that is not something that is going to play well into China's long-term geopolitical planning, I think.
Okay. We can talk about China in some more detail another day and focus more there. But today I want to give a broader overview. The last hotspot I want to talk about is Ukraine. Now, I want to ask you to clarify this for us, Pyotr. Earlier in December, The White House has said that it is unable to pledge more aid and military support for Ukraine. The Senate Republicans unanimously blocked a bill to provide more than $110 billion of funds to Ukraine. What's happening there from the U.S. side, and how will this affect the war?
Yeah, it's a good question. And just for clarity, so the aid is split into three main areas. It's
Mhm.
financial, humanitarian, and militarily.
Right.
Nearly two-thirds of it has been military versus, say, the EU, which has predominantly been financial. Um, Compared to other recipients, the US received what, 75 to $80 billion, and this package of I think another 60 is significant. By contrast, Israel only gets about 4 billion a year. What's going on there is and I know some people listening and watching will not like this term, but it's some people call it war fatigue, which is basically that the longer the war goes on, people begin to have to rekindle the fact that they have their own issues. And I think that this is playing out in the US in the run up to not just an election year, but a really important election year. The hardliners in the GOP are playing, hardball because they want either reduced funding for Ukraine or just more of the funding to be pivoted towards things, namely like immigration. There's a massive, ongoing issue with immigration on the southern border, and people who are, not saying all pro just Trumpists, but people who are just on the like Vivek Ramaswamy's types are really pushing this emphasis of we've got to focus on our issues first instead of helping others, and that is disruptive for US policy making, and it's disruptive for US foreign policy. And as this leads up to the polls and the run up to the election, it's only going to intensify. And I think that the Biden administration, no incumbent president wants a war in the Middle East, let alone a massive kinetic warfare in the in Eastern Europe, and it's considered a bedrock. So the war is, I would say that the war has largely been at a stalemate for a long time. Collectively, the Ukrainians' counteroffensive never, unfortunately, reached its what they said it would. They've made roughly around 10, 12 kilometers worth of gains. And that was because the defensive measures the Russians put in place are extensive. Estimates say that to demine Ukraine as a country in the Eastern Bloc would be 20 to 30 years. So there was little hope for the Ukrainians to make massive gains, and there's little hope for this year. So I think it's going to depend what happens. More is going to happen, I think, off the military field than on it, in the form of diplomatic and political maneuvering. I'm not going to make, I can expand on that if you want, but from a US perspective, I think that they are trying to manage a lot of different spheres. The US is undoubtedly still, whether you like it or not, militarily speaking, the only country that can, militarily influence around the world. And they are being tested right now with the amount of fronts that are happening.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Perfect. So are we going to see a de-escalation then of the Ukraine war, or just broadly speaking, what is going on?
So what is going on right now is that the two sides are still largely not moving very much. The fighting is very intense. Like, just because you're not seeing much movement doesn't mean that there are massive casualties. The US came out with that figure of 330,000 fatalities, I think, for the Russians. People will dispute it, but even if it is exaggerated or not, it gives you the scale that we're talking about. Putin wants to mobilize another 170,000 troops, which would put the overall mobilization at this point to over 1 million, almost 1.1 million or something. It's crazy for the size of the area that they're fighting. So for me, I think about this in terms of a spectrum. You can have an outright victory for the Russians, an outright victory for the Ukrainians, and then somewhere in the middle, including obviously a draw. And personally, it's difficult to see how the Ukrainians could mount a effective counteroffensive again that would reclaim all of the land and Crimea, which is what would kind of constitute an outright victory. An outright victory for the Russians is, they would say that they want all of the areas that they control and a little bit more, but most people would, I think, agree that they also wanted to force the removal of Zelensky and make Ukraine more Russia orientated. So it's not looking like an outright victory on either side. And again, the longer that this goes on from the American perspective, in terms of the election pressure, that's going to indirectly and inevitably play into what happens in Ukraine. I'm not going to pretend that suddenly the war is over by the end of this year, but I think you could see conceited efforts to push towards a dialing back of
Sure.
expectations and a
Well,
potential marginal victory, in the sense that Ukraine accepts that the territories that Russia still controls are, well, maybe Russian, but Ukraine is fast-tracked into NATO or given direct security assurances. Again, this is all completely speculation, but it's I don't think the baseline scenario I'd say for this year is a continuation of this current intensity, and for the stalemate to sustain until something off the battlefield, as I said before, makes maybe a sizable shift on the battlefield.
don't you think though that the U.S. could appear weak if they withdraw funding in any sort of way, unless this is sort of just a pause, they're taking a hiatus and then they're reorganizing their budget to allocate different forms of funding to Ukraine. But I know, for example, they still, I believe they still have their Lend-Lease program. But the point is, Piotr, if the U.S. suppose they stop funding the war, I'm not saying they will, but just suppose they do, and suppose the Russians win or declare some sort of victory again. I'm not saying they will, but just hypothetically, suppose that happens, the U.S. will be extremely embarrassed, where they not? They spent billions upon billions of dollars funding this war, and their side lost. They can't do that.
Mm.
That would destabilize a lot of trust from its allies, would it not?
I don't know if it would destabilize the trust. I think it would definitely intensify the Europeans' desire to be more strategically and militarily
Okay.
autonomous, which we've seen them developing. It's a really tough question, to be honest with you. I would say that no, it wouldn't. No, no one's kidding. It would not look good from an American perspective, given the absolute outright statements that we've had from the United States and others saying, we will support you to the end. I think it was even France yesterday or a couple of days ago, someone said, it
Yeah.
was maybe Canada. We're supporting you to the end. We will, yeah, it was Justin Trudeau. I think he said yesterday, we will not stop until, an all out victory, is achieved. But that's the thing. A lot of these countries are not putting in the amount the United States is. And so it is ultimately, if the US decides to pull or curtail funding, that would be an embarrassment.
Yes.
It would be. But at the same time, they might not have a choice. The US is facing a lot of challenges. One of my favorite expressions I heard from a political scientist I appreciate is, the biggest threat to the US isn't China or Russia, it's itself right now. And that's because of the political turmoil, the paralysis, and social unrest, which can all play into the economy. So what does the American government, not just Biden, but and also because, we've got Colorado, we've got Maine making these incredible
Yeah.
decisions,
Hmm.
and suddenly it's now being put to the Supreme Court.
Just to
So
clarify, you're talking about Trump not being on the ballot, right? That's what you're referring
not
to?
being able to run, yes.
Okay.
So the push now is for him to be put towards the Supreme Court of the United States so that this matter can be put. And the reason I'm mentioning all this is because if these things continue in such a way that the United States is uncomparably distracted, it just inevitably will struggle, I think, it may well provide the funding, but it might not be as consistent and it might not be as effective in terms of its where it's applied. So yeah, I think it would be a massive embarrassment, but external forces, unexpected events, inflection points may well cause the United States to make a shift anyway. I'm not saying we go from 100 to 0, but it may well reduce that, which ultimately Ukraine is beginning to increase its own military industry anyway. They're investing heavily in producing their own things in-house because they know the foreign imports are erratic and will continue to be. So it's a really tough question, and I know I didn't do a sufficient answer, but
It is a tough question. It's fine.
I'll have to come back to it.
We will, yeah. We don't we're running out of time, unfortunately, but that was great. Great the overview of the entire world and what investors should be watching. Where should we watch you, Piotr? That's my last question.
Well, I mean, if people have enjoyed I wrote all these notes and they've kind of deviated all over the place. But if people would like to hear me speak to people, much better as an interviewer than perhaps, they can find me. Just type my name, Pyotr Kurzin, into YouTube.
Yeah.
But also, I think the Global Gambit podcast,
Okay.
and I interview people across the political spectrum. It's not an echo chamber. It's not tunnel vision. We try to be as diversified as the David Lynn report.
Well, it's an excellent show, if I do say so myself. So please check out Pyotr's channel, link in the description down below. Thank you again for being here. Happy New Year. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.